In the previous video, it was shown that the peoples of the Neolithic Fertile Crescent had achieved a number of developments that would determine the future of human life on this planet, including agriculture, animal husbandry, herding, mining, the mortar and pestle, the kiln or earthen oven, and the first expansionist tribes and chiefdoms. One of the less disastrous developments of the period was pottery, for the purpose of storing food and other dry goods. When archaeologists comb over ancient dig sites, one of the main things they're looking for besides tools is pottery shards. These tend to survive the ravages of time better than many other artifacts and can be used to identify the spread of ancient cultures over time. The first true pottery began flourishing in the Fertile Crescent about 8000 BC and can be broadly divided into two distinct cultural styles, whiteware and darkware. Whiteware was developed around the chiefdom of Byblos. Aside from the chiefdom's thriving cedar shipping economy, the peoples of Byblos engaged in the business of mining and quarrying limestone in large quantities. They pulverized the limestone and utilized the recently invented kiln technology, heating it to over 900 degrees Celsius in order to calcify it. When cooling, the lime could be worked by hand and molded into the shape of a pot, which could then be used to store grain, beans, and other crops. Whiteware was useful for purpose, so long as it wasn't moved very much from the place where it was made. It was incredibly fragile, and people likely had to replace their whiteware pots relatively frequently compared with later forms of pottery. Over the course of the 7000s BC, the people gradually began hand-molding clay and mud to use as an interior layer of the pots to make them less fragile. They fired the clay hard in their kilns, and the limestone plaster became an outer coating. Darkware, or dark burnished ware, developed from this original limestone prototype. Over the generations, there was a tendency to remove the lime plaster from the process altogether, instead relying on the dark clay-mud mixture, often reinforced with sand or hard dirt. They hand-molded the mixture into the desired shapes and then baked them hard in earthen ovens. The results were pots, jars, and bowls that were significantly less fragile than whiteware, and could therefore last longer before breaking. By 7500 BC, this pottery style was becoming dominant in the region, being made by all peoples within Byblos' sphere of influence. Later examples tend to be more carefully burnished and decorated, sometimes with hunting scenes or agricultural designs painted on them. On the Mediterranean coast, they were often decorated by the shells of cockle mollusks impressed into the sides of the pot. The Byblos chiefdom at this time would have consisted of Neolithic towns and villages that practiced settled agriculture and herding year-round, and had the highest population and population density of any society on Earth at that time, with its capital, the city of Byblos, controlled by a high chieftain and priests. Lesser chiefs and priests might control large towns within the chiefdom besides the capital, taking tribute from local villages and paying a portion of it to the capital in taxes. Within a chiefdom, the chief's main jobs are to lead the army, collect tributes, and make babies, as well as encourage others to make babies. They also claim to speak with the gods on the people's behalf, negotiating good rainfall and bountiful harvests. In war, they frequently either march at the head of the army or else are carried out on a royal litter or palanquin. A portion of the adult male population of each town and village would be drafted for war, creating an army capable of marching along the region's freshwater systems, besieging or assaulting towns and villages and massacring resistance. Around the borders of the chiefdom, and others like it, there was a thick crust or membrane of tribal peoples practicing an intermediate way of life. Perhaps they live in a settled village year-round, but nevertheless live entirely by hunting-gathering. Or perhaps they only grow crops for part of the year and live as semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers in another part of the year. Individual circumstances varied to a significant degree, but they were often overseen by local shamans or big men. Outside of this thick crust was a frontier of hunter-gatherers living in nomadic bands, still by far the most common way of life for humans. Meanwhile, in what is today southeastern Turkey, great villages like Kayanu, Halan Chemi, Navali Kori, and Göbekli Tepe continued to flourish, even though they did not embrace every new development that was emerging in the region. Each of these great villages evolved a central cult with a dedicated priesthood, and stood in the midst of a cluster of smaller villages whom the priesthood would have exerted control over. The ritual blood sacrifice and consumption of slaves captured in war is evident especially at the two largest sites, Göbekli and Kayanu. In both of these sites, along with Navali Kori, there have been archaeological finds of stone structures, bowls, and other artifacts which the people painstakingly carved out of calcite alabaster quarried out of the local limestone caverns. They did not have access to the kiln technology at this time, greatly increasing the manual labor needed to work the stone. The people would mobilize under the direction of their shamans, whom they believed had a connection with the spiritual world or else direct contact with the gods. Until roughly 8000 BC, the people of these towns still largely engaged in a pre-Pottery Neolithic A form of life, longer than their counterparts in Syria, Lebanon, and Canaan. In summer, much of the population would leave their respective villages to camp in the countryside and conduct hunting expeditions, gathering food in a semi-nomadic way. They hunted gazelles, boars, onagers, and red deer, as well as fish and oysters in some areas. They gathered wild crops in large quantities, mostly assorted cereals and pulses, pistachio nuts, and almonds. The rest of the populations remained in the villages year-round as settled peoples. They grew crops, mostly emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, and they tended animals, pigs mostly, but with some towns relying more on cattle, sheep, and/or goats. When the hunter-gatherers returned in winter, they shared the stored surpluses of those that had stayed in the village, and engaged in maintenance and construction projects. This mixed lifestyle of farming, herding, hunting, and gathering, however, became gradually less common as the gazelles and onagers became endangered and seasonal hunts became less sustainable. By 7500 BC, a gradually higher percentage of people in each community were staying home year-round, and there was a higher emphasis on farming and herding, as well as the building of megalithic structures using alabaster and sandstone. The structures would have taken months to build and may have been constructed under compulsion. I say this because there's a remarkably high number of human skeletons unearthed from these sites that show bone abnormalities and injuries caused by labor-intensive processes and an increasingly grain-based diet. They carved images onto their stone monuments of scenes from nature, including predatory animals like lions, vultures, snakes, and even arthropods. Göbekli Tepe, which itself was built on top of a limestone plateau, is especially famous for its carved stone pillars, its shaman's ritual platform, which was hewn directly out of the local bedrock, and recent archaeology has uncovered a large stone totem resembling the totem poles of Native American tribes and chiefdoms. However, they never seem to have achieved a high enough population density to launch great wars of expansion, unlike the Native Americans and unlike the Biblo Chieftdom. Over the course of the 7000s BC, Byblos and its holdings were expanding rapidly in the wake of food surpluses and population booms, conquering territories on their borders owned by hunter-gatherers and frightening their agricultural rivals into tributary submission. This expansion may have been partly inspired by agricultural necessity, as this was before the days of crop rotation, and the desaturation of the soil convinced many leaders to turn to invasion to keep their growing populations fed by grain and livestock tributes. Old important towns like Murabet and Asliki Hoyuk were destroyed and abandoned outright, refusing to submit. Other centers like Abu Huraira submitted to tribute and were occupied. Their goods, technologies, and crops were spread around the entire chiefdom, and much of the wheat that we eat today is descended from the emmer and einkorn wheats that were grown at Abu Huraira at the time. In towns like Jericho and Ein Ghazal during this period, there was a great effort to reinforce the stone walls and construct towers. By around 7000 BC, numerous tribes and proto-chiefdoms in Syria, Turkey, and Canaan were conquered by Byblos and its tributaries, and over the next few centuries they show a characteristic shift towards permanent large-scale agriculture, pottery, and plaster flooring made using lime kilns. This shift may have been inevitable, as there was already considerable depopulation of the local fauna from seasonal hunting expeditions conducted on a great scale every year since 10,000 BC. The proto-chiefdoms of eastern Turkey seem to have been especially apprehensive about adopting full-scale agriculture, and cannibalism in the form of blood sacrifice had reached its greatest extent. In any event, the invaders attempted to force the people to adopt agriculture and herding, and those settlements that refused were depopulated. New townships began to flourish in this atmosphere of domination, such as Halula, Balkros, Yumuktepe, and Katalhoyuk, which over the next 1,000 years would become a major powerhouse in the region. But for now, Byblos was the heaviest human settlement on Earth at 5,000 people. At sea, they developed their cedar longboats into a navy, which conquered the agricultural tribes of Cyprus, and thereafter took possession of the island's bountiful sources of native copper. They established further colonies in coastal southwestern Turkey, the Isle of Crete, and by 6500 BC even as far as Greece, the culture's greatest extent. To the northeast, agriculture spread back gradually along the Araxes River, where it eventually gave rise to the Shulavari Shomu culture in Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. South of there, the hill folk of the Zagros Mountains gradually came to rely heavily upon herd animals such as sheep and goats, eventually constructing villages such as Jarmo, Ali Kosh, and Ganjdara. In North Africa, agriculture and pottery spread via trade and warfare from Canaan and the Sinai at some point around 6500 BC. Rapidly in some areas, as it was already well adapted to the winter rain seasons, which the Fertile Crescent and North Africa happened to share. In the millennia before this period, all across the Sahara, the climate was more humid and forested, and held numerous great lakes teeming with wild fish. In this period, termed the African subpluvial or African humid period, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers flourished and their populations grew. Some settled natively into tribal villages numbering from a few dozen to a few hundred people, cultivating crops like sorghum and pearl millet, and these crops became popular around the region. By about 6000 BC, wheat, barley, beans, and peas came to supplement the dominant crops already domesticated in North Africa, until the foreign crops became more popular. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats also spread. Vegetable cultivation increased and diversified, and alcoholic drinks like beer and wine were discovered. It seems therefore that the Sahara had all the ingredients necessary to develop large-scale expansionist chiefdoms. Around this time, however, the world was undergoing a minor cooling event, which would have crippled any developing tribes and chiefdoms primarily reliant upon agriculture, having a tendency to split apart into different factions squabbling over resources. This cooling event is what's known to scientists as the 8.2 kiloyear event, a worldwide recorded reduction in populations beginning around 6200 BC due to the death of food crops from the cold. The populations with the highest densities tended to suffer the worst, and this is what ended the Biblos chiefdom, from then on being followed by a number of successor cultures, such as the Halaf culture of Syria, the Yarmoukyan culture of Canaan, and the Cardial culture of southern Europe. Besides shifting the political landscape around quite a bit, some peoples, such as the invading Byblos farmers on Cyprus, seem to have starved completely, ending major agriculture in Cyprus for the next 1,000 years. By 6000 BC, these climate changes had ended, although their occurrence had significant consequences for the history of civilization, and it's those consequences which will be discussed in great detail in the next video.